It is time for part 2 of my shim tutorial. In this video, I'm going to be covering the process of making a resin mother mold or support shell over the silicone mold I made with shims in part 1. So if you haven't watched part 1, definitely go back and watch that, because without that, this part 2 will not make any sense at all. But in part 1, I built a shim wall using wax paper cups and put some little blister keys in it. And I did this all using 5130F platinum silicone. Now, part 2 will cover two very important parts of this process. One is the construction of the mother mold or support shell, and for that we're going to be using a hard resin. And then, of course, the very important part of demolding your pattern, because this kind of process, it is a little bit tricky with the shim method. We do need to go in and do a little bit of surgery with a scalpel to remove our part. And then that will give us a silicone mold that kind of snaps in to our resin mother mold. And then that silicone edge there, that flange, will give us a nice gasket that provides a good seal when we're casting materials like resin, or if we're casting wax patterns or foam or whatever the case may be. The whole idea is for that to function like a gasket when it's all sealed together. Now, for the mother mold, we're going to be using a plastic called BR75D. This is a self-thickening polyurethane resin. And this does not require any reinforcement material like burlap or fiberglass or anything like that embedded in it. Obviously, you could do that for additional strength, but as it is, the BR stands for brushable. So BR75D is a self-thickening, hard 75 Shore D brushable resin. Of course, it's self-thickening, has about a 10 to 12 minute working time, and about a 2 to 3 hour demold. And it's a 1-to-1 mix ratio by weight. Now, BR75D, like most polyurethane resins, is very adhesive, so we want to make sure we protect any area where we don't want the resin to stick using high-temp Part-All paste wax. Now, Part-All paste wax comes in a few different formulas, and I'll link those in the video description, but the high-temp formula handles applications like this a lot better than the regular number 2 paste wax. The high-temp wax handles resins that have a higher exotherm. So you want to apply that paste wax to any surface that's not silicone. If you do need to release your silicone, a light spray of E302 is usually sufficient for that. Now, BR75D, make sure you mix up that part B before you mix it with the part A. Anytime the labels say stir or mix thoroughly before use, you want to make sure you do just that. So always check your labels. Make sure if something says shake or stir that you do that before mixing that with the other components. So here I'm stirring up the part B, and then again this is mixed 1-to-1 by weight. So I'm going to measure out my part B first, and I like to measure out the part B, or the higher viscosity material, into the mixing bucket first. And the reason for that is I'm going to be matching that with the second material, the part A. So it's much easier to control the part A. So if I measure out, say, accidentally do 455 grams of part B instead of just 450 grams, it's easy to match that with the part A. And the reason I typically use one bucket, especially with a material like this, is it makes cleanup a lot easier. I only dirty one bucket, and it just minimizes waste. So you do need to be more careful and more mindful as you're pouring, but you do save a lot in mixing buckets and in the overall mess in your shop. You don't wind up with a lot of buckets with residue in them from going back and forth between multiple buckets. Now, as always, with your mixing, you want to make sure you scrape the sides and of the bottom of the bucket really well. Get everything mixed up thoroughly. And once your parts A and B are fully mixed, you'll wind up with a mixture that is has a little bit of a drippy quality to it, but still really thick, and that's ideal for this first coat. We're going to be doing this shell in 2 layers. The first layer we're going to put on as is, just right as this comes from the manufacturer. It's going to have that a little bit of a drippy property to it, and that's ideal for getting in that detail around those keys, because we want to make sure we get everything covered adequately without air bubbles or voids between the resin shell and the silicone mold. Now, this is where you can really see the benefit of that shim method, because you see we're able to apply that mother mold material on both sides of the mold at one time. So that means we don't have to lay the piece down flat to do one side. Now, obviously you can do that, but if you're working with a really fragile clay sculpture under that silicone mold, then sometimes laying the part down is not an option. So sometimes you have to work vertically, and that's where thixotropic materials are really helpful. Now, you can typically build this up to about 1/8 of an inch thick by itself before it starts to really slump a lot. So be mindful of that and don't try to build up too much at one time, or you'll wind up with a lot of wasted material slumping off your piece. Now, the other thing we want to be very careful about is you want to use a stir stick or a popsicle stick to clean up that edge constantly and expose that seam. And that way we don't have to grind or sand that down later on. So you'll notice I'm going back with a stir stick and just cleaning up that seam and making sure that we're constantly exposing the edges of the mold. And that will minimize the work we have to do later on, cleaning up that mother mold and how much sanding or trimming we have to do to that shell. The more you can do while the material is wet, the better off you'll be. Now, the demold time for BR75D is typically 2 to 3 hours, depending on the cross-section of the piece. But in this case, we don't need it to be at full strength. We just need it to tack up enough that we can apply another layer without disturbing that first layer. So our second layer, we want this to be really thick. This is our second and final layer. So here I'm mixing up more BR75D mixed 1-to-1 by weight. And then I'm adding to it the Fiberthick thickener. Now, the Fiberthick can be used to add additional thixotropic qualities to that BR75D, because as it is, it's already fairly thick and that self-thickening brushable quality. But for this, we want it even thicker. We want to really remove any of that slumping that we get when we're building up that shell extra thick, because ultimately on our mother mold or support shell, we want that to be about 1/4 of an inch at a minimum, up to about 3/8 of an inch. You really don't need it thicker than that. If you start building it up too thick, you'll wind up with a lot of wasted material and unnecessary weight. And that's the whole point of this method, is so that we have a lightweight mother mold. Now, you'll notice I've added enough Fiberthick to where this is like a frosting-like consistency, and you can use the side of the bucket to gauge how thick the material is before you start making your mold. So when you can smear it up on the side of the bucket and it stays put, that's a good indicator that you're ready to start applying this to your mold. And again, we can apply this to both sides, so just a lot more economical use of our time to be able to make both sides of the mold at once. Now, as you're building up your thickness, you want to be mindful of that edge. You see the silicone peeking through there at the base, but also on the sides. That flange is really important that we keep that clear. Not the end of the world, but that's going to make it a lot harder to open up that mold later on if we cover up that seam with plastic, because that will stick the front and the back half together. So once I'm done with the brush application, then I switch to a trowel. And by trowel, I typically mean like a stir stick or tongue depressor. Anything like that will work. Just remember, this is really adhesive material, so that's why I'm not using that nicer palette knife that I used for the silicone application. So once I get that resin applied all over my piece, then I'm ready to start shaping that again with a trowel. And we want to make sure that we get that edge nice and thick, because that's where we're going to have the most abuse on the mold. When we're setting it down on a workbench, that edge of the mold, the flange, is where it's going to be prone to chipping or cracking. Now, BR75D is a really strong resin material, but still, we want to make sure that that's thick enough that we don't wind up with it chipping in really thin sections. So you want to make sure that's at least 1/4 of an inch thick on that edge. And you'll be able to check that by going back along that edge here, as you'll see me do here in a minute, with a stir stick or a popsicle stick. And you can just drag that along that edge and expose that seam, and that's a good way to check your progress and see how thick the shell is that you're building up. And of course, this can obviously be done with Hydrocal or UltraCal 30. Typically in the art bronze world, if expense is of concern, if you're trying to keep your mold cost low, using a molding plaster backed up with hemp is a good way to go. That's a relatively lightweight way to do it, but plaster and hemp still can get pretty heavy on larger molds. But when you start doing bigger molds, especially again in the art bronze world, a lot of times you'll be sloshing a wax, and having a really heavy, cumbersome hydrocal mold can become a problem. So having a lightweight mold where you can slosh a wax positive or resin positive is really helpful. And now I've switched to the wide tongue depressor here, and I'm just cleaning up that edge and cleaning up those little drippy areas. And you want that as smooth as possible. Now, obviously, it doesn't need to be perfectly smooth, but what you want to be thinking about here is that resin, when it cures completely, that BR75D cures to a very hard 75D. And left unattended, those little wispy peaks you see developing there, some of those can really be sharp later on. So as much as you can, you want to push those down with a tongue depressor or stir stick. And you see me there cleaning up that edge to expose that seam. The more of those little pointy areas that you can eliminate now will eliminate cleanup work that you have to do later to this. Because obviously later on, once this resin cures completely, it can easily be sanded. But to minimize that, getting this shell really nice and smooth will save you a lot of work later on. So now I'm just going back, checking my work, making sure that flange is cleaned up. See me working that seam again to remove any resin that's crossing over that seam. And that way we don't have to worry about that front and back sticking together. And then just going in and smoothing out that shell as much as possible. Now this is about 3 hours later. And as I mentioned earlier, the demold time is dependent on the cross section. So with urethane resins, typically the way it works is the thinner the cross section, the longer the demold time. So it's the opposite of an air drying material. So the thicker the mass, the faster that's going to kick off. So if you build this up really thick, like a couple inches thick, it's going to demold much faster than a thin section. So be aware of that. If you've made a really thin shell, you want to give that a little bit more time to demold. And you can usually gauge that by the thinnest area in the mixing cup of whatever is left over from applying your mother mold. Now here I'm just using a flathead screwdriver to apply a little bit of pressure there to open up the mold. And if you've simplified your form to where there's no undercuts between the resin shell and the silicone mold, the only thing that's really holding the resin on at this point is the suction of the silicone against that fresh resin shell. So there's our first half pulled off. And now once I pull that off, while the resin is still a little bit on the green side, I can use a razor knife to clean up any little thin areas that crept over that edge a little bit. And the tools I like to use for this is just usually a regular razor knife or work knife, and then one of these rasps. So you can pick these up at a hardware store in the woodworking section. This is a wood rasp that works on a pull stroke, and they're excellent for cleaning up these areas. These work fantastic for removing those little sharp resin burrs. And now that half is ready to go, and we're ready to remove the front half of the mold. Now again, I cannot stress this enough. Anytime you're making brush-on molds like this is why you want to make that outside surface of your brush-on mold as smooth as possible, because that will make that a lot easier to remove. And this is why you want to make sure that you simplify that form so that it easily slides out of that resin shell. Because the suction will be a little bit holding it in place, but if you have little undercuts in that that silicone mold that are grabbing on, or really heavy drippy places that are grabbing onto that shell, it's going to make removal very difficult. And if you're casting wax patterns, that can really become a problem, because the last thing you want when you're removing a wax pattern is the mother mold to snag on the rubber mold underneath and then break that fragile wax underneath. So real important to make sure in that stage where you're making your silicone mold to get everything as smooth on the outside as possible. Now for the fun part. This is like Christmas morning, where we come in and remove that shim material and cut open our mold. Now using these wax paper shims like this, you get the best properties of a brush-on mold and a cut block mold, because basically once we remove those shims, and here I'm cutting through just that little bit of membrane of silicone on the edge of that seam, but you notice because I kept that fairly clean, I don't have to worry about a lot of silicone overlapping that's closing up that mold. So just getting rid of the connecting silicone there, pulling out that shim material, and then we're cutting through the remainder of the silicone, the first couple of layers I put on that cross over from the front to the back half. So that connecting layer and what I referred to as the shim tack silicone that I used to stick that shim down earlier, that little bit of silicone, it's typically going to be maybe 1/4 of an inch or so of silicone down at the base of those shims that we're going to cut through using either an X-Acto knife or other hobby knife or a scalpel. Now personally, I prefer a scalpel because they have really nice super sharp blades that will easily cut through the silicone and any other material. You just want to be very careful, obviously, not to cut through something that is attached to you. And you'll notice I keep a little slug of silicone. That's silicone that I poured into a mixing cup. Some of the extra silicone that I poured into either a small mixing cup or a Dixie cup. And I use that as a knife holder, so I can just stab my X-Acto knives or scalpels into that when I'm not using those. And now you see how that mold is opening up, so I'm just carefully peeling that back. And you can see there I'm just cutting through that little bit of a membrane of silicone that's still connecting the front and back half. So take your time with this step. This is one of those steps that's very difficult to videotape this process. So bear with me here. A lot of this is one of those kind of tedious things to do, and it's even more tedious when you try to film yourself doing these things. So I'm just carefully peeling that back and cutting through that remaining silicone. Now this is one of the reasons that I mentioned in part 1 that you typically want to use a silicone or polyurethane that's between a 25 short A and a 35, maybe a 40 short A. Is this part gets really tricky when you exceed like 40, 45, or 50 short A. This step is really difficult to do. Trying to peel apart layers of rubber that are really firm gets really hard to do. So that's one of the reasons why I typically stick with that range of about a silicone that's about a short A 25. And again, this TC5130F, that's what it measures at, is right around a 25 short A. So this is ideal for that, and especially that TC5130F, the fast formula, that allows me to make a mold like this in an afternoon, depending on how complicated the piece it is I'm working on. But this is why material selection is so important, so you don't wind up working against the silicone or polyurethane you've chosen to make your mold with. Now, there is my finished silicone mold. And sometimes you might have a little bit of straggling little piece of tape or cardstock or anything left over from your shims that you might need to peel out. But overall, our mold is done, and we are now ready for casting. I'm going to do some follow-up videos showing how to do some rotational casting with some TC808, so be sure to stay tuned for that. And of course, we could obviously cast wax patterns. Now, I don't need any wax patterns of this little pizza rat, but if we did, he is now available to be cast for foundry work if that was the direction I wanted to go. But now you see how those pieces of the silicone mold can just snap into that shell. And because of those little keyways in that resin mother mold, everything just snaps right back into place. And then, of course, we can put those two pieces of the mold together and strap that, or if we want to, we could drill holes and put some mounting hardware there to seal everything up. One little trick that I've found, if you do really complicated molds like this with a lot of keys on that flange, sometimes it helps to put a little bit of petroleum jelly on those key shapes. And you only have to do that once in a while, but that little residue of petroleum jelly will really help those keys fall into place a lot better when you put the two halves of the mold together, especially if those keys are not all on exactly the same plane. So there you have the process of making a two-piece silicone mold using shims and a resin mother mold. And as usual, I'll put all of the materials I used, I'll put links to those in the video description, so be sure to check those out. As I mentioned earlier, material selection is uber important to the success of this technique. Now, for those of you just getting started with brush-on molds, I've put some other resources here on this end screen, so be sure to check those out as well. And as always, if you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe, and of course, click the little bell icon so you get notified when I post new content. And thanks for watching.